I'm Tom Ryan. I'm the president and CEO of Lancaster History. It's my pleasure to welcome each of you here. I know many of you are familiar faces, and many of you are members and contributors, and we thank you for your ongoing support. Cell phones. If you have a cell phone, put it on silent, please. We appreciate that, and our speaker especially will appreciate that. A couple upcoming events. On Wednesday, October 30th, please join us for a celebratory book launch. The Worlds of James Buchanan and Thaddeus Stevens, Place, Personality, and Politics in the Civil War Era. This came out of a conference we held several years ago, and we'll have our three editors from this collection, as well as one of our local historians, Louise Stevenson, to moderate a conversation between the three editors. And I'm sure it'll be, they're a great group of folks, and they're a lot of fun to be around. So I think you'll learn how books put together, but also some of the themes and aspects of the conference. The reception and book signing starts at 4, starts with a reception, and the panel discussion will feature 3 esteemed historians who have essays in the book as well as editors. Michael Berkner from Gettysburg College, Randall Miller from St. Joseph's University, and John Quist from Shippensburg University. If you haven't registered and you'd like to, just see someone at the front desk or go to our website. On Thursday, November 14th, Dr. Kathleen Cahill will join Lancaster History to offer a more diverse view of the history of women's suffrage. Dr. Cahill will draw on extensive primary resources, research that she's done to discuss how Native people were central to the vibrant conversations about U.S. citizenship and women's suffrage in the Progressive Era. From that angle, we'll see a more inclusive story of indigenous feminists who marched in parades calling for suffrage and for sovereignty, Native American men active in national political parties, and the backlash against Native political participation. So stay tuned for that. That's Thursday, November 14th. Some of you may have had a chance to stop by the table hosted by the Friends of the Tangier Arboretum. This is a great group of folks who really assist Lancaster History in administering and caring for the Louise Arnold Tangier Arboretum. So I want to thank those folks. Jeff Hazlett, are you in the room, Jeff? Jeff's way in the back row. Jeff's the president of the Friends of the Tangier Arboretum. I see Ruthie and Bob and a bunch of others. Lori and Denny, I think you're here. So if you're interested in learning more about the Tangier Arboretum, that can be found on the website as well. The 18 acres surrounding the White House have been an unwitting witness to history. Kings and queens have dined there. Bills and treaties have been signed there, and presidents have landed and retreated many times over. During our Mr. Buchanan's presidency, the First Lady, Harriet Lane, had a new wooden greenhouse built on the roof of the West Terrace, adjacent to the state dining room. This evening, we're delighted to be joined by Marta McDowell, who will discuss how the White House grounds have grown with America. Marta McDowell teaches landscape history and horticulture at the New York Botanical Garden and consults for private clients and public gardens. Her latest book is The World of Laura Ingalls Wilder, The Frontier Landscapes That Inspired the Little House Books. Timber Press also published All the President's Gardens, a New York Times bestseller, and Beatrix Potter's Gardening Life, now in its 6th printing. Please join me in welcoming Marta McDowell to speak on All the President's Gardens.
There we go. Ooh, a little shorter. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Emily, for having me here. I should tell Tom that my mother's name was Mary Ryan McDowell, so maybe we're related somehow. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is tell you a little bit about how I came to write this book and share some of my favorite vignettes from it. Now, as Tom said, I tend to write books about people who write and garden. He mentioned Beatrix Potter, Laura Ingalls Wilder. I've written a book about Emily Dickinson and her gardening interests. So my publisher, Timber Press, is in Portland, Oregon. And so here's the way it works. One day I called my editor, Tom Fisher, and I said, Tom, I'd be really interested in writing a book about that Concord, Massachusetts crowd. I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, right? Emerson and Thoreau and Louisa May Alcott and her father, Hawthorne, and the list goes on. Now, in addition to writing together, they also gardened together. Tom, my editor, said, gee, that sounds really interesting. I'd buy it, but I don't think anyone else would. So much for that idea. Really, now, he said, we haven't published a history of American gardening in a while. Would you like to write that? Now, I am sure that Tom thought that I was sitting at my desk in Chatham, New Jersey on the phone and sort of, waving the flag and cheering like this fellow on the cover of the Iowa Seed catalog from around 1900. Now, instead, I was sitting at my desk and I had a feeling like another one of the great protagonists of American literature. See if you recognize him in the next picture as depicted by Gregory Peck. Anyone? Who is this? Captain Ahab. Captain Ahab, if you haven't read the story in a while or watched the movie, Captain Ahab goes out on this long, obsessive quest after this big white whale. And, it doesn't end very well for Ahab. And that is what writing a history of American gardening sounded like to me. Really, I thought this will take me the rest of my life. It's a big place, right? This map doesn't even have Alaska and Hawaii on it. And depending on where you start counting, we've had a fairly long history. Now, you hate to turn down an offer for would you like to write a book. They don't come along very often. So I mulled this over a period of a couple of weeks. Now, have any of you been teachers in the room? Have you ever taught? Yeah, quite a few of you. Okay, so you'll know what I mean when I say you are often taught by your students. And what popped into my head early one morning was a project that a student of mine at the New York Botanical Garden had done about the White House grounds. They do a short research project, a one-page handout, and a 10-minute presentation, and I thought, wait a minute, that could work. It could limit the scope, and I wouldn't have to, write about everything. And so I run downstairs, and I tell my husband, who's generally very supportive of my ideas, and he said, oh, you're going to steal from a student. Nice. I did not steal from this student. He has acknowledged I asked him before I got started, and he was very kind to say, yes, I could take his idea and run with it. Now, the other thing I do like to have when I'm working on a book is some little tiny personal connection. And it was hard with the White House. I had no connection to either people who were upstairs or the downstairs staff. But I did find this image. This is the back of the White House. So this is the south portico. It's probably around 1920. Now, I know there are a lot of gardeners in the house. So what is that plant at the bottom left-hand corner? Yeah, hydrangea, big panicled hydrangea. And among my family photos, I had that one. The woman in the sunbonnet is my great-grandmother, Katherine Ryan. She was born in County Clare. She came to America as a teenager. She made her way out to the Illinois prairie. She had family out there. There were some coal mines out there, so some of the Irish came over to mine coal, and that's where she settled. And the little girl is my mother. This was around 1924. But note, the hydrangea. Even for my purposes, it's even sort of in the same spot. But it was just a little reminder that the White House is, in many cases, if not a style setter, at least an early adapter and a way that styles have moved through our country. And so off I went. So I started my story in 1608 with the first gardeners on the continent. And this is what it looked like in a village not far from where our nation's capital is today. In 1608, you have to imagine Captain John Smith. He's at Jamestown. He gets into a big open wooden boat with 14 other men, and they start to row up the Potomac. It was already called that. That is an Indian name. And they did not find gold, which I'm sure they were hoping to find, but they did find agriculture. There was already organized agriculture that had spread across the whole continent. And what were they growing here? Well, the kids learn about it today, right? The Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash. What else were they growing? Tobacco, a different kind of gold, a sort of brown gold, but it became a very important part of colonial history and the history of our nation as well. It turns out that archaeologists have also found evidence that they were growing a grain. It's, we call it goosefoot now, and most people will weed it out of their gardens. It's a little gray-leafed plant. It grows in New Jersey. I'm sure it grows here as well. And I learned that it is a relative of quinoa. Quinoa. And you don't have to raise your hand, but I was one of those people who thought it was quinoa until I heard someone say, I really did. All right, we're going to fast forward to 1797. So, a little presidential trivia for you all. Did George Washington ever live in the president's house? No, I know this audience will be full of ringers, right? He never lived there. I think of him now like Moses, right? He sees the promised land. He has a very big hand in designing it, but he never lives there. He was already in retirement when he started consulting on this new federal city that was to be built. He had help from a French architect named Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, right? L'Enfant had come over with Lafayette. And L'Enfant was French. He grew up in a little village called Versailles, right? He studied in Paris. So, of course, he lays out a French city. And if you think of the map of Washington, D.C., right? It has these long, straight boulevards. He was in love with the sight line. All this geometry, circles. It's why it's impossible to drive around Washington, D.C. You can thank L'Enfant for that. If he had had his way, the president's house would have been directly at the end of one of those long, straight boulevards. But Washington had different ideas, kind of more English in influence. He said, no, I want the president's house to be up on that little rise of land, a better view, better air quality, and much more like the positioning of Mount Vernon, which is not that far away as the crow flies. So that is why if you get, let's say, you come out of the Washington Metro at the National Archives stop, and you walk down Pennsylvania Avenue, you will find that to get to the White House, you have to take a zag. And that's the whole reason why, because Washington had his way on that. So, who was the first president to move into the president's house? John Adams, very good. John Adams moves in. He moves in at the end of 1800. He's toward the end of his first term. His wife, Abigail, joins him about 2 weeks later. Abigail Adams was a woman with very definite opinions, and she immediately sits down to write her daughter back in Massachusetts to tell her about the condition of this house and grounds that they have just moved into, the brand new president's house. And of the landscape, she said, we have not the least fence, yard, or other convenience. Not at all impressed, right? That same letter goes on to say, I'm hanging my wet laundry to dry in the unfinished receiving rooms, right? It wasn't really done. Nowadays, you'd never get a certificate of occupancy. I think things were looser then. She even talked about the trip into town, and she said, woods are all you can see on the way from Baltimore until you reach the city, which is so only in name, right? Remember, this was a city built basically from scratch. There were some villages, things like Georgetown predate the nation's capital, but basically it was farmland and swamp, and they just built it up from scratch. Now, John and Abigail did not have to suffer these circumstances for long because he loses the election. The next election, and the very next year, early in the year, they pack up. They do not even stay for the inauguration of their former friend, and will be friend again at the end, Thomas Jefferson. Now, when I got to Jefferson, I thought, this is great. You know, I've got it made now, because Jefferson was a lifetime gardener, and he was one of that Enlightenment gang that wrote everything down. He's like a researcher's dream. But it turns out while he was at the White House, he didn't have that much time for outdoor gardening. Now, for you Arboretum folks, he did do tree planting in Washington. He did not have the budget to plant many of his favorites, which were willow-leaved oak. He planted Lombardy poplars, which turned out to be not a great selection, but who knew at the time. And he did some indoor gardening. According to his friend, Margaret Bayard Smith, in Jefferson's office in the president's house, which he called his cabinet, he grew geraniums. And they were like this big fuzzy leaf geranium painted by Rubens Peale, or Rembrandt Peale. Anyway, one of the Peels. And so it's a big fuzzy thing. You can still find them. They're called Old Scarlet. But unlike, nowadays, you can buy a geranium at any supermarket or, Target. Everybody's got geraniums. This was an exotic plant at the time. It was a South African import and very unusual. So he had geraniums. Among the geraniums, he had these on plant stands in the south-facing windows. He had some kind of container-grown roses. So roses are part of the White House history from the very beginning. And he had a bird cage for his pet mockingbird, right? Not legal anymore to cage wild songbirds, but it was not unusual at the time. And right up to 1900, you see mockingbirds in catalogs if you needed to order a pet bird. They're good mimics. We even know the name of Jefferson's pet mockingbird. While he was president, the bird's name was Dick. Yes, when I read that, I thought, I can't make this stuff up. It's just too good. I mean, evidently this bird would sing along when Jefferson played the violin, right? The whole bit. Now, Jefferson always loved to plan things, and he was a two-term president, so by the end of his second term, he was starting to plan for big plantings on the grounds, and he and architect Benjamin Latrobe sort of established what would be the front and backyard for the president's house. Come on, there you go. So the front was the formal carriage entrance. It's the one with the triangular pediment that you always see behind the newscasters. And then the back was the south portico, that one that was sort of rounded. And that was much more park-like. So the front was much more French and geometric in style. The back, much more English. And he actually wrote in words on the plans in Jefferson's handwriting. And they say things like groves and shrubberies, right? It sounds very romantic, almost like Jane Austen. So Jefferson does the planning. The next president, James Madison, does the planting. So the orders for plants and seeds go out during the Madison administration. And he was ordering lots of trees, both native and exotic, so things not from the North American continent, lots of shrubs, things that you would still plant in your gardens if you're like me, roses, Rose of Sharon, lilacs, right? Very popular then and now. And lots of vegetables, because at the time, the president's house was really like a small gentleman's farm, and they were growing crops for the table as well. So they were getting lots of seeds from Philadelphia. They ordered from a seedsman named Bernard McMahon, and they also got seeds from the Shakers, and they were known as a very reliable source of high-quality seeds. They were also great at sort of packaging and marketing. They're really the ones that standardized on these little pre-printed paper seed envelopes. So when you buy your next set of seeds, think about the Shakers. So all this planting goes on. And what happens? It doesn't last long, because 1814, yes, the British march into the federal city. They burn the federal buildings, including the president's house, and the gardens are ruined. So it's the next president, James Monroe, that has the president's house rebuilt. It is at that time, it is given a very bright white coat of paint to cover up some of the char marks from the fire, because they retained all of the stonework. And it's after that that it starts to be informally called that White House, right? That's not adopted as the official name until much later, but it started then. James Madison has some help with the replanting, James Monroe, from James Madison's own personal gardener, who was French. His name was Charles Bizet, and this was the first bill I could find from a gardener to the federal government. So Charles Bizet charged the federal government $137.17 for work from April 1st to June 30th. Did various things, spread a lot of loads of manure, repaired tools, and did some hand mowing at $1 a day, right? Imagine with a sickle or a scythe. That is not easy work. So we're now sort of rolling up into the 1830s, 1820s, 1830s. You do start to see some images of ornamental grounds at the White House. So again, look at this. This is the South Lawn. You can see another method they used to get the lawn short. They would borrow a neighbor's flock of sheep, right? Helps keep the lawn cropped and fertilized at the same time. You can see people strolling like a public park, right? There's a man walking his dog, a couple strolling in amongst the flower beds, and the first image that I have found of someone actually working on the grounds, right? It's easy to talk about the presidents, but for the most part, they had staff doing the work. At this period, it would have been a gentleman named John Ouseley. He was an Irishman. He came to America as an adult. He comes in through South Amboy, New Jersey, which is in the record. He makes his way to the nation's capital. He gets a job, and he stays there for 25 years. He actually lives somewhere on the grounds in an old little building that is no longer there. John Ouseley was of interest to me because he taught John Quincy Adams how to garden. John Quincy Adams, right, this is John and Abigail's son. He was a very learned man. He was a lawyer. He'd been a diplomat. He was not a gardener when he became president, but he had had a very contentious election, the election of 1824. There were a bunch of candidates. There were two front runners, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Jackson won the popular vote. But it was so close, given the rules at the time, it was thrown to the House of Representatives, and the other candidates backed John Quincy Adams. Now you can imagine Jackson supporters, they were not thrilled, and they called it that corrupt bargain. And they fought every single thing that John Quincy Adams wanted to do. And he was kind of depressed. You can find this out by reading his diaries. They are all in the Massachusetts Historical Society. They're also actually online in his handwriting. If you have nothing to do this winter, there are about 40 volumes of them. I only concentrated on the period of his presidency because he suddenly discovers the garden, and he starts to garden basically every day when the weather is reasonably good. He was a very committed man. He would get up very early in the morning, something like 4 a.m. He would often go for a walk or a swim. He'd work in the garden for an hour, read a chapter of the Bible, have breakfast, and go to work. So, he really, put his all into it. And I found in his papers, so you have to imagine I'm on microfilm machines. You remember those, right? Microfilm, it's actually film. You stick it on, you put it in, it's black and white, and it goes around. And I'm up in Boston at the Historical Society. And I see this. I've seen diary pages, but I've seen them online. I suddenly see this, which I have never seen before, and my heart rate goes up because I'm that kind of person, because it's a little plant. And in his handwriting, it gives various dates in 1827 and 1828 of an apple seed that he has planted, and when it germinates, and how many leaves it has on such and such a date, and when I transplanted it, and when I put it in the garden, and how tall is it in the garden by the next year. He loved trees. So he often collected tree seeds, acorns, walnuts. He would spit out the apple seed after he'd have a piece of fruit and go plant it. So he really was a gardener. So isn't that a wonderful thing? So, this appears in the book. I think it's the first time it's appeared in print. Look, if John Quincy Adams wanted to enter the Philadelphia Flower Show with his apple tree, he would have the whole propagation record. It's awesome. Okay, but he was only a one-term president. He also started America's first forestry project. But I shall go on. To Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, he was immensely popular. He was a populist. He was a war hero. And I know he was absolutely cool because I found this on the internet. I did. It's amazing what you can find, right? It proves that people have way too much time on their hands. Yeah, I know, I had to show it. What could I say? So Andrew Jackson, he is, he's elected in 1829. He comes to Washington, he's inaugurated, and then just like today, there's a big party after the inauguration. Now, his supporters were so raucous that they worried for the new president's safety. So if any of you are party planners, keep this in mind. It was too crowded in the house, so they moved the barrels of whiskey out to the garden. And that got the people out, and everything was fine. Now, truly, Jackson was at this point in mourning, because just before he came to Washington for the swearing in, his wife Rachel had died quite suddenly at their home in Tennessee. And the story goes that Jackson brought seedlings or cuttings, but small southern magnolias, and planted them near the south portico. Now, when I saw them last, they were basically all hollow and cabled. I don't think they've been completely cut down, but recently they had to be taken out for safety reasons, and they will either grow on a piece, from a sprout, or they're actually starting new ones from seed in the nurseries as well. It's too bad, but it was, 100 years old, so. It did appear on the old $20 bill, right? There it is, up here, right? That's the Jackson Magnolia. All right, onward. If I did talk about every single president, we would be here all night. So here we go. This is like the 1840s into the 1850s. This is the front. The statue that's now in the Capitol Rotunda, right, of Jefferson was moved to the White House front lawn by James Polk, and then it was later moved back. You can see the rose trellises, and there used to be very elaborate ironwork on the front of the White House. And we'll skip ahead to James Buchanan, right? So James Buchanan comes to Washington with his niece, Harriet Lane, as you well know. Now, Harriet Lane, I discovered when I was doing this research, because this was new to me, was sort of like Princess Diana, right? She was the fashion plate of the time. So people in the news were very aware. What was she dancing? What music was she listening to? What kind of clothes was she wearing? And the fact that James Buchanan, as Tom said, put on this proper conservatory onto the White House for her. And I'll just read a little excerpt from the book. So Buchanan indulged her with a proper conservatory. It replaced the orangery Andrew Jackson had installed for overwintering citrus and tender palms, and that in turn, Franklin Pierce had expanded into a greenhouse by trading its solid ceiling for one of glass in 1853. Harriet Lane's conservatory was a more elaborate affair, a high ornamented glass sunroom devoted to the display of plant specimens. Breathe. The air had a quality of moist and rich, perfumed with citrus trees. Mysterious mouths of pitcher plants yawned. Aloes and cacti spiked. The plants in the White House Conservatory created a compact world where jungle and desert, bog and scree all met. A journalist captured his impressions in 1858. As you enter the conservatory itself, it seems almost like penetrating the luxurious fragrance of some South American island. So warm and odoriferous is the atmosphere, right? So you get an idea of what this was like. And really, it's part of a craze for glass houses that went across not just America, but really the whole Western world. And it all started really with the Crystal Palace exhibition in London. Okay, so we'll move along. The glass house shows up in early photographs. So here it is on the left-hand side where the West Wing is today. So it was on the west side of the White House. You'll notice that the south lawn had a sort of retaining wall. Jefferson had that built during his administration. Again, you notice people lounging on it. You know, it was very open in those days. And the fact that we did not invent graffiti in the 20th century. Can you see that is 19th century graffiti? Now we get to Mary Todd Lincoln, and like Hallie Lane, Mary Todd Lincoln loved flowers. She's often photographed with these floral headpieces or corsages. The gardeners would make them all for her. There was no split between gardening and floral arranging at that time at the White House, and she often had nosegays as well. Now, Mary Todd Lincoln also liked to buy things, right? She had a sort of retail habit. She bought a lot of clothes, and she was also redecorating. And you know, the White House needed it, but it gets very expensive if you start to reupholster things. And she ran out of money. The appropriation was gone. Her creditors started asking for payment, and she was in trouble. So her gardener said something to the effect of, "No problem, Mrs. Lincoln. I'll make it look as though I bought more plants and soil and seeds, and you can pay your creditors out of the grounds budget." Now, if there are any accountants in the house, right, this is a no-no. Congress got wind of it. They called it the manure fund. And the gardener, Mr. Watts, got fired. And I don't know what Mrs. Lincoln did after that. I suppose President Lincoln had to pay the bills. But during his administration, one of the staff said that the White House was kind of like a casual Southern plantation, right? It's well below the Mason-Dixon line. And you know, Mrs. Lincoln used to go out and pick strawberries. The younger Lincoln boys had pet goats that would always get into the flowers, so there's lots of correspondence from the gardeners complaining. And I did find in the National Archives, these are in College Park, if you want to see the big old maps, College Park, Maryland, the first sort of as-built drawing of the White House grounds. Again, it's mostly the central 18-acre core. It probably extends a little further to the bottom, but I'll just point out, okay, let's see, here we are. This is the White House. There are the conservatories. They kept growing. They kept being added on to. I was very excited. It's a little hard to see, but over here, it's clearly still a vegetable garden. It's rows and rows of plants. And then this thing that looks like, I don't know, a cello or a squash. I had read this description. It was from a congressman who he had a tirade about all things presidency. And he was complaining about everything. It's during the Lincoln administration. And he called something on the White House grounds Amazon's bosoms. Now, if you sort of squint and look at this map, right, you'll see what he meant. And there are these two, like, hummocks. I don't know how to describe them. They're clearly, kind of man-made. And they're still there. And now you will never be able to get that out of your mind. So anyway, we're going to skip ahead again, up now to Rutherford B Hayes. I now remember Rutherford B rhymes with tree because he loved to plant trees, both at his home in Ohio and at the White House. So he and his wife, Lucy Webb Hayes, started the tradition of commemorative tree planting, and it still goes on today. They also started the Easter egg roll, still goes on today. And they were teetotalers. They were temperance advocates. This is way before Prohibition, but during the Hayes administration, the White House was dry. There was no alcohol served, and not everyone was really pleased about that, including their Secretary of State, who was quoted about one of their parties saying, "It was a brilliant affair. The water flowed like champagne." This was their Secretary of State. So instead of, I guess, offering you an after-dinner drink, at the end of the dinner, the President and First Lady would rise from the table, everyone would stand up, and they'd take you through two new doors that they had punched into the state dining room, into the conservatory, and give you a tour of all of the various plants, and there were little fountains in there at the time, and I guess that was the end of the party. They had brought with them from Ohio a gardener, Henry Pfister. He was Swiss. He had been trained in Europe, comes to America, goes to Ohio, then comes to Washington. Again, he stays at the White House for 25 years. So there's these people have long lengths of service. He worked on the inside gardens, and those gardeners all worked for him, and he took care of the ornamental grounds outside. So this is at about that period. If you look out the front door, what you're looking at is towards Lafayette Square, and you'll notice a Victorian planting now. So now we get into that carpet bedding that was so popular at the end of the 19th century, and look at the potted palms. So that's really what it was like at the time. Looking out the back door, and again, this map is small, so I'll point out a couple things. Here's the White House. Looking across the south lawn, what you saw was the unfinished Washington Monument. The Washington Monument was started out as a private project. Citizens got together and collected money. It was started in the 1840s. We're now up to 1880, and it's not done. So the federal government says, we're finished. This is embarrassing. We're going to give it to the Army Corps of Engineers to finish. And so they do finish it if the light is right, you can tell where they picked up. Can you see the line? Yes. So it slightly changes. And again, put yourself back in the day. When this was getting done, this was to be the tallest man-made structure in the world. This is pre-Eiffel Tower. So this is really a big sort of, pride thing for our nation, that we've made it. And so, of course, they have a big fireworks celebration when the Washington Monument is dedicated in 1885. Chester A. Arthur was president, and I was so relieved because I had to find a way to get Chester A. Arthur into my book. I did, because my husband graduated from Union College in Schenectady, and so did Chester A. Arthur. And so this was really important that I get some garden connection. This is the way books are really written. Now you know, like all the dirt. Grover Cleveland, a New Jersey president, he was great and is great for bar bets, right? So who was the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms? Grover Cleveland, right? Benjamin Harrison is in the middle. Who is the only president to have married in the White House during his term of office? Grover Cleveland. So when he married Frances Folsom, a lot of newspaper coverage, over-the-top floral arranging, which is described in the book, and this picture appears. You can see how the trees have grown in. You can also see how the glass houses have expanded. By this time, there was a rose house, a violet house, an orchid house. They did all of the propagating for cut flowers as well as bedding plants. And if you think the artist exaggerated, there is a photograph, right? It's a huge complex under glass. Many of the presidents and first ladies loved the glass houses. There is Mrs. McKinley, her picture taken amongst the tropical plants. William McKinley loved carnations. The gardeners would deliver fresh carnations to him every day. And sadly, William McKinley is one of our presidents who was assassinated. He was assassinated in Buffalo, New York. He was opening a World's Fair. For many years after his death, America celebrated Carnation Day on his birthday. That's completely forgotten, but January 29th used to be Carnation Day for William McKinley. Now, when McKinley died in Buffalo, who became president? Theodore Roosevelt. Oh, you're good, you're good. So Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. Teddy Roosevelt is young. He has a big family. This will come in to the story of the White House grounds. He became a great favorite of mine as I was doing this research for a couple of reasons. He was super energetic, the national parks. He was a bird watcher, and he wrote picture letters to children. So did Beatrix Potter. There's a wonderful little book called Theodore Roosevelt's Letters to Children. He wasn't the artist that Beatrix Potter was. But notice this letter. This is to his daughter. He writes, "Darling Ethel, here goes for the picture letter." And he puts in a little cartoon, and underneath it, he writes, "Ethel administers necessary discipline to Archie and Quentin." There are Archie and Quentin with, I guess it's the Secret Service in those days, right? Archie is saluting. Quentin is actually yawning at the camera. It's a very cute picture. So Theodore Roosevelt says, look, I have no space to get my work done. The first floor is all public rooms. The upstairs rooms were all full with his children, and he didn't really have office space. So he calls an architect named Charles McKim, very famous firm, McKim, Mead & White. I need more space, and that is when the glass houses go away. They were all taken off. That's when the predecessors to the east and west wing are built. They moved all the plants. They actually moved some of the glass houses, although by now they're all gone. There is Quentin helping. I'm sure he was a big help that day. And so anyway, and that's the end of the glass houses at the White House. When they finished the additions, the president and the first lady wanted a new kind of garden. Now, no longer a Victorian garden, they wanted colonial revival. So full of old-fashioned plants, lots of roses, these little boxwood edges. And when Theodore Roosevelt wrote about this garden to his children, he always called it Mother's Garden. So there she is, out in her garden. Come on, there we go. With the Tafts, in comes the automobile. Lots of changes to the American landscape, started with Henry Ford. And also, Mrs. Taft brings another horticultural icon to our nation's capital, and that is the cherry blossoms. She did not do it alone. It's a complicated story. They were a gift from the government of Japan. It took 2 rounds because the first set of 1,000 trees were infected with insects and had to be burned. Talk about a diplomatic problem. But they did eventually get another set. They planted them. They were immediately successful. So that's when the cherry blossoms came in. There were 2 Mrs. Wilsons. The first Mrs. Wilson was a painter. She was a gardener. When she moves in as First Lady with her husband, Woodrow Wilson, as president, she wants a new garden. So she doesn't want that colonial revival garden. That was so 10 years ago. She now wants Italianate, right? The styles change in gardens as well as in clothing. So she calls a woman she knows that they had worked with at Princeton, named Beatrix Jones, later Beatrix Farrand when she married, to design an Italianate garden. But the first Mrs. Wilson died before the garden could be installed. Now, Woodrow Wilson, you know, I guess he was one of those men that didn't like being alone. He loved his first wife, but he was quickly smitten with a new woman. And 1 year after the first Mrs. Wilson, he remarries Edith Bowling Galt. During their courtship, Woodrow Wilson wrote, "You are the only woman I know who can wear an orchid. On everyone else, the orchid wears the woman." Right? Did you know Woodrow Wilson had it in him? I did not know that. So anyway, they married. She has the garden that the first Mrs. Wilson designed. She has it put in. There they are, standing in the new East Garden, the Italianate garden. Of course, this is also the period of the First World War. Sheep come back to the White House lawn. It's sort of symbolic. They shear the sheep and they sell the wool for the Red Cross. And it was the period when Americans were being asked to garden for the first time for patriotic reasons. I do love this poster, the War Garden Commission, because look at the potatoes in the middle, right? What is the matter with them? They do not like their placement. So war gardening, I know, I love that. Okay, between the wars, we have what? The Roaring '20s. I now think of it as the Downton Abbey period, right? Look at Mrs. Harding. She is the one with the feather in her hat and with that wonderful skirt at the bottom. She is congratulating the winner of the tennis match on the White House grounds, right? Just as we all at various times in our lives tend to have some sort of sports equipment on our property, the White House does too. And the Hardings had one very famous first canine. This was Laddie Boy. Laddie Boy, they would actually organize sort of news conferences for Laddie Boy. Remember, the Hardings were in the newspaper business before he went into politics. So Laddie Boy is actually sitting in the Rose Garden. So even then, behind the West Wing, there was a rose garden. So there's been a rose garden, really, again, at the White House since Jefferson and Madison. Love Laddie Boy. A Boston newspaper asked Laddie Boy if he wanted to become president. During the Second World War, there was actually a victory garden on the White House grounds. It was tended by one of Franklin Roosevelt's advisors and his family, but Eleanor Roosevelt was very supportive of the idea of victory gardening. We'll move ahead to Truman. Truman wanted some privacy. Now, I'm sure it's not easy to be the first family, and Bess Truman did not like first ladying at all. So he goes to Congress with an idea and 2 architectural models, so these little scale models. And one of them, the one on the top, shows these awnings on the south portico. That's what it was like, Teddy Roosevelt and Edith Roosevelt used to have breakfast under those awnings. But Truman says, look, let's take off the awnings and insert a balcony from the 2nd floor so that we can have a private outdoor area. And after some hemming and hawing in Congress, they did put it on. They called it Harry's Porch. It cost $15,000, which seems like such a bargain now. It's like I can't call a plumber for less than $300 anymore. My brother told me to go into plumbing. Anyway, so Truman got his porch, and yet they didn't really get to enjoy it for long. Because during the Truman administration, some structural problems started to appear with the White House. Things like their daughter Margaret's spinet piano leg punched through from the 2nd floor, right? They could see it through the ceiling of the 1st floor. And they decided that the White House was actually unstable. So they move out the first family. They lived at Blair House, and they reconstructed the White House from the inside out. Now, in 1952, the Trumans are about to move back into the White House. And, as luck would have it, Harry Truman was expecting a visit from the Queen of the Netherlands. So he wanted the garden to be put back in shape, like instant garden, right? This was like HGTV. So the newspaper said they're rolling out the lawn, like wall-to-wall carpeting, right? This is the 50s, right? They said the White House has been redone right to the tip of the TV antenna. They were very proud of that. And look at the size of the boxwoods being brought in from Goody Nurseries in Maryland, giant boxwoods. They were planted in front of the north portico, and they are still there, growing and called the Truman boxwoods. Name one other thing that our federal dollars have been spent on that have lasted since 1952 like that. Anyway, even a full-size cherry tree in bloom was put in that week, so I guess he got his garden. Eisenhower loved golf. He had a putting green designed and installed. I know he's not putting. I couldn't find a picture of him putting. I even called the USGA. They didn't have one either, but I found a cartoon. It is from the Washington Post. Here is President Eisenhower. I apologize in advance. So he's trying to make his putt. Notice he's missing his putt because a squirrel has dropped an acorn out of the tree. And it is absolutely true. I'm not making this up. During the Eisenhower administration, the gardeners were instructed to trap and transport the squirrels. In other words, to try to get rid of the squirrels. You know you can't do this. It doesn't work. And then someone in Congress started a Save the Squirrels campaign, right? It's like nothing, things are, we say, oh, it's so awful, but really it's just the same. During the Kennedy administration, of course, Mrs. Kennedy starts to redo the inside of the White House. I remember the TV, tour of, it was very exciting. We all watched the same thing at the same time. It was amazing. It was President Kennedy who said, our gardens are starting to look shabby. And so he calls a family friend, Rachel Lambert Mellon, Bunny Mellon. She was a horticulturist, very capable. And he said, would you help me? I want to redesign these gardens. They start with the one right by the West Wing. They come up with a plan. She goes to put it in, obviously with help. And so interesting what you find when you dig at the White House. So they come up with like horseshoes, right? And old pieces of the glass houses, because that's where it was. And one day they cut through the national security telephone line and triggered an atomic alert. Yes, it's true. I checked. So the moral of this story is call before you dig. Doesn't matter where you live. It is true. This is the rose garden. This is the spring, and there are lots of things other than roses, but there are roses in there, and it was popular from the start. They ordered 3,000 tulips for the first planting, the beautiful Catherine crabapples, and I will say Mrs. Mellon funded a lot of the garden as well. It's still the plan that's followed, although it has been completely replanted once because the trees got too big. And it was so successful that they asked Mrs. Mellon to design a companion garden for the east side, so kind of the mirror image of the White House. And it was about to go in, there we go, when the Kennedys left for Dallas. And so it was not installed until the next administration. Lady Bird Johnson had the garden installed on the east side. She dedicated it to Jacqueline Kennedy, which is why it's sometimes called the Jacqueline Kennedy Garden. And of course, Lady Bird Johnson, so well known for beautification, Keep America Beautiful, wildflowers. We need another Keep America Beautiful campaign, in my opinion. So the gardens, they've been used for so many things. There was a wedding of one of the Nixon daughters out in the Rose Garden. There was the bicentennial party. So 1976, this is Nelson Rockefeller, the real queen, if you've been watching The Crown, and Gerald Ford. And they're exchanging toasts. They're under a tent out in the Rose Garden. The Queen, very assertive that evening, because in her toast, she said, "Mr. President, history is not a fairy tale." And she goes on to talk about the British burning of the White House. Which, yeah, given like where she's sitting, that seems like really amazing to me, but that's also true. There have been diplomatic efforts in the Rose Garden. What goes on in the Rose Garden stays in the Rose Garden. Jimmy Carter with Anwar Sadat. There have been children and lots of children's play equipment out in the garden. Again, this is Jimmy Carter with Amy Carter, and I think it would be her nephew, a little tiny boy, and his grandson. There was a big age difference in the Carter children. The tree is a big blue Atlas cedar on the south lawn. That's still there. That play equipment is long gone. They are changed from time to time. May she rest in peace. First Lady Barbara Bush with another famous White House canine, name of, anyone know? Millie. Millie had the puppies. And so it's been used for lots of pets, lots of various things. During the Clinton administration, in the East Garden, a series of American sculpture exhibits. And during the George W. Bush administration, here they are planting a new tree on the north lawn. The trees do not last forever. Trees are living things. You cherish them. You try to get them to live as long as possible. But sometimes they do have to be replaced. And let's see, the trees. They're beautiful trees on the White House grounds. This is a ginkgo, but there are a lot of native trees as well. And then during the Obama administration, Michelle Obama puts in a kitchen garden. The kitchen garden, somebody said, oh, the kitchen garden was taken out by Mrs. Trump. That's not true. The kitchen garden's still there. It's no longer the First Lady's project for the new First Lady, but the kitchen garden does last. I did not land a plane on the White House lawn. I did not climb the fence, although there were nights when I thought I might have to, because it's much harder to get access to the grounds than I thought it would be. So I did what, people say, call your congressman. That is literally what I did. I called Rodney Frelinghuysen at the time, and he and his staff got me tickets. You can go generally twice a year. They have a weekend in the spring and one in the fall when they have an open garden tour. You have to, give them, I think, your social security number. There's some security check. You go through, a detector. But it's great fun. You'll be with a lot of your fellow citizens. It's a huge crowd. They do rope things off, so you can't just go everywhere. But it was a lot of fun. They had the Marine Corps band playing. That was the closest I could get to the Rose Garden that day. It was kind of excruciating. But I did see something I was looking for because I had read this article, I think it was from the 1970s, where the head gardener at the time, from somewhere, they had gotten a statue of a male deer, a stag. And they'd put it outside the Oval Office. So this is the Oval Office. Do you see the stag? You see his little nose? It's pointing out of the hedge. And they put it there because of Harry Truman's famous saying, "The buck stops here." That's the Oval Office, right? It's still there. And isn't that great? It's now, a little secret White House humor. It's like I was so happy to see it. I was able to go back again with the help of Congressman Frelinghuysen and his staff to run around after the head gardener at the time. This is Jim Adams over here. They're moving so fast. They're doing everything that week because that was during the Obama administration and they were not at home that week. So you can see they're trading out annuals and they're cleaning up and they have construction equipment. So I was able to run around and see a lot of things close up, including the kitchen garden, which is quite lovely. I will tell you, I was just drooling because the labels are done by the White House calligrapher. They're so beautiful. Anyway, quite lovely. See the beehives, they're beehives. Here he is, he's checking the temperature of the compost bin, and you can see they're National Park Service employees, so they're wearing the green and gray. And look at his pocket. Right, they're real gardeners, because he's been deadheading while he's been walking around with me at about 20 miles an hour. I was really out of breath, just getting a tour. He's, doing everything at the same time. So, it's been an interesting history. It was fun to research. I did not go down with the whale, as it turned out. I did need the occasional Alka-Seltzer. This ad, which I bought on eBay, would now be illegal. You cannot use the White House for any product promotion. But at the time, you can see the old card, this was a legal Alka-Seltzer ad. And I now like to think of this as our common ground, right? It's wherever you stand, it is part of our tradition and history, and it's beautiful at all seasons, certainly in the spring. And I'll just close. This is my favorite quote from the entire book. It was said by Irv Williams, who holds the record for the longest tenure as head gardener, 47 years. He started with the Kennedy administration. He works all the way up for George W. and Laura Bush when he retires. And he once said, "What's great about the job is that our trees, our plants, our shrubs know nothing about politics." Thank you very much.